Council. So this series, again, is brought to us through funding with the CAP program. So we're really pleased to be partnered with OMAFRA on delivering this series. So this is our second last update for the fall. Next week, we're going to kind of do a round the horn update, but tonight we do have a couple of specific topics that we're going to dive deep into. As always, we've got links, resources, maps, handouts, all sorts of stuff. Anything you hear about tonight is going to be posted on the Biosecurity and Disease website sometime very soon, as well as all of the previous recordings. And I just wanted to give a little shout out to a presentation that we had last week. So we had Dr. Keila Price talking about health checks through fecal, through visual fecal analysis, basically. So she gave us a really great talk on how we can kind of keep health checkups going and know when we need to work with our veterinarian to dig a little deeper into a potential issue with our flock. So we're going to have that up on the website pretty soon. And she referenced a poster, which is a great visual tool. It's kind of a quick overview. We're also going to have that posted sometime this week as well. So stay tuned for that. So joining us tonight, as always, we've got Victoria Wilson with CWHC. She's going to give us a quick overview of what's going on in Ontario and maybe a little bit of an update on BC. British Columbia did have a special update last night, so we're not going to deep dive into that topic particularly tonight. Brian Stevens is going to talk to us about what's going on in the wild bird world and possibly in the mammalian world as well. Al Dam is going to just do his normal general update, and he's got some interesting visuals as well just to share with us from the wild bird side. And then Dr. Luci has gathered a whole bunch of interesting information on pigeon research, which is something new for us to kind of bring to the forefront as well. As always, if you have a question, just pop it into the Q&A in the bottom. And that's all I've got for now. So I'm just going to turn it over to Tori to take away.
Thank you, Ashley. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to share some good news in the fact that we have not added any new infected premises to our list of detections since the last time we did talk. And we also released 2 entire primary control zones in this past week, which is something to be excited about. So primary control zone 138, which is around IP37 City of Ottawa, has been released, as well as primary control zone 122 around IP33 Township of Alfred and Plantagenet. If you were within either of those control zones and have movements that involve another active primary control zone, you will still be required to have permits. However, if you can avoid the current zones that are still up within the areas, your movements entirely, then we don't require anything further in regards to surveillance or movement. So this is another 2 zones off the list as we continue to move in the right direction. So here in Ontario, we currently have 4 active primary control zones, and within each of these zones, the euthanization of the birds on the infected premise have been completed, and crews are working towards the processes to get each site to become released. So that's IP35, which is working towards primary decontamination right now. IP38, 39, and IP40 are all working towards building compost piles and reaching that primary heat treatment to be able to move to the next milestone. So things are all status quo at these sites. There's no delays I'm aware of. They really just have to go through the motions and reach all the milestones along the road to revocation. So for the folks in BC, if they are on this call, I was hoping to have a little help tonight to go through kind of the happenings of the West, but with the response still going pretty strong out there, it's kind of an all hands on deck mood right now. So I'll give a little brief update on the situation out there to the best of my ability. I would also like to highlight that I was made aware of a small flock call that was held by the Ministry of Agriculture and Food that happened last night. So I hope you're able to attend and get some of your specific questions answered. I am hopeful they'll continue these, but I don't know if they are or not. So just continue to watch for that. And hopefully you'll be able to get some more answers. So now for the basics on the BC response. Currently, BC is at 69 infected premises since April 13th of this year, with there being a big break in cases from June 18th to September 12th. Since September 12th, we've added 51 infected premises, which they have they have definitely revoked a couple of those primary control zones over the time. So right now there's 42 active primary control zones in BC alone, with 4 primary control zones still being determined. Throughout the entire response, so since April 13th, there's been 47 infected premises deemed as commercial poultry, 13 more are non-commercial poultry, and 8 are non-commercial, non-poultry, with 1 being classified as captive wild non-poultry, which totals the 69 infected premises that we have had since the beginning of this response in BC. So I know it's not a huge update on BC, but I'm hopeful it does paint a little bit of a picture of what things are currently looking like out there. And I do encourage anyone here from another province to reach out to your local groups if you have any, or Ministry of Agriculture and Food, just to see if they have any more information or they can point you in the direction to find out more. Also, I encourage everyone on here to practice good biosecurity habits, continue to take this very seriously. And I was happy to not include any new detections in my update today. So I hope we can continue this trend next week.
We do as well. So thank you very much, Tori. And yeah, definitely our hearts go out to British Columbia. It's such a mess out there, I guess is the only word for it. And there's a lot of producers who are really struggling. So on that note, we do have the mental health helpline listed on the PIC website. In Ontario, we've done a lot of efforts to put mental health at the forefront of things. But certainly there should be resources right across the Canada. So hopefully those are being taken advantage of. So now I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Thanks, Ashley. So I don't have as good news as Tori did. We are still continuing to see cases in our wild birds and mammals on the landscape. So over the past couple of weeks, we have had a handful of positives. Most of them are in southwestern Ontario at this point. A few different species of geese, a crow, and a raccoon. So we are still seeing in both the water birds and the scavenger species. And we do have a few die-offs that are happening as well that may or may not be related to avian influenza. We're still waiting on getting more birds from these areas to determine exactly what's going on. One of them is a group of crows where there have been a couple dozen crows that have died in one area. That is something that could be related to a different virus, but one of the crows that we have had come in from that was the crow that tested positive. Another crow from that site tested negative. So we're hoping to get a few others to test as well to determine exactly what's going on with those crows in that area. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is wild bird migration is still ongoing. It may not seem like it in most areas, but there are a large number of snow geese and other birds that are moving throughout Ontario. So in Eastern Ontario right now, there was a large group of snow geese that are moving through the province. I think Chris Sharp had mentioned there's around 50,000 geese in the area at the moment. And with that big group, there have been mortalities associated with that. Al's going to show some pictures just to give you a visual as to how many geese are there. And with those animals that have been dying, Chris and his team have been on site, and he has reported that some of these geese that are sick and dying are looking like they are infected with avian influenza just by the behavior that they are exhibiting. So we are getting those animals in for testing now to determine exactly what's going on with them. But we assume that some of them are dealing with avian influenza at this time. And that is all I have right now, but I'm happy to answer questions at the very end.
Brian, I just had a thought. Can you just remind us what the big whoop is about all of this intermingling or, multi-species getting avian influenza?
So the big issue is, for humans at least, when it jumps into mammals, that gives the virus a chance to adapt to our cells. So obviously bird and mammal cells are going to be slightly different. And this influenza virus is mostly adapted to avian cells. So the more chances it gets to jump into mammals, the more chances there is for mutations that could potentially lead to increased ability to infect mammals and increased ability to spread from mammal to mammal. So that's one of the big things that we're watching with this. And even when it's spreading amongst birds, the more hosts that it's able to get into, the more chances that it has to mutate, similar to what we've seen with COVID-19. Luckily, this virus doesn't mutate as readily as COVID-19 does, but there are still chances for some mutations to happen and to allow for this virus to better adapt to some of these hosts, including humans potentially.
Right. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna have Al Dan come on screen here.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and I'll pull up a couple things I'd like to share. So once again, I'm hoping you guys can see that. You can see that, Ashley. I'm hoping.
Looks good.
Okay, great. So once again, do the promotion for the Poultry Industry Council Biosecurity and Disease website. So you go from the front regular page of the PIC and just go to the resource page. Poultry, the disease and biosecurity page comes up where we have been making this your one-stop shop. As Tori mentioned, this is the current map of Ontario, and some zones in Ottawa were released, but we still have some active zones, which is IP 38, 39, and 40 down in that Strathroy area between just north of the 402. So these are 3 commercial sites, lots of turkey at these sites. They're all 3 are turkey sites, which tells us that we are still in the thick of things. If we look at the USGS map, it doesn't look like it's been updated a whole lot from the last time I showed this, but we do have that cluster in BC, and we're still getting positives across the country. Maritimes have still been relatively unscathed for this fall, but they're all expecting to see something. Midwest is still dealing with a pile of avian influenza. This is Turkey Central here. This is why you're hearing information about turkey shortages in the news. That's more of a US thing, but yeah, turkey prices are going to be high, and we are going to have some challenges getting your Christmas turkey potentially in Canada, but not nowhere near what the issue will be in the US, or with egg prices too, because they've lost some fairly large egg complexes in the US in the last 3-4 weeks. They are still getting positives. We're still getting APHIS feeds every day that are showing that. Now, Brian had mentioned about migratory birds. We do have a fact sheet on deterring migratory birds. It's off the biosecurity and disease page at PIC. If you just scroll down a bit, there's a dead stock page. There's another one, deterring migratory birds, which is this one. If you're dealing with migratory birds on your site, there's a fair number of things you can do to deter them, because that is going to be our challenge. Speaking of those birds, Chris actually flipped some pictures to myself and some of our wildlife folks about what he was seeing out in Eastern Ontario. So this is part of the 50,000 bird flock of snow geese that they're seeing flying through the area in Eastern Ontario. So there's a lot of poultry in Eastern Ontario. If anyone's from Eastern Ontario listening tonight, I would suggest you really tighten up your biosecurity, make sure that you're not walking this disease into your barns or your coops or whatever, because there's just a lot of birds out there resting at water bodies and resting in fields. So just be very aware. And from that, Brian mentioned that this batch of birds had been found at a lagoon in Eastern Ontario, and these were the ones that were neurological that Brian was mentioning. So we are going to have, my guess is Brian's going to have more information to tell us from this batch of birds. And this was only part of the birds that were found at that site. More were having to be buried because there were more that they couldn't get at. And the folks around that area are going to be watching to see if we have more of these neurological snow geese. Now, that being said, it's still in the air. It's still moving around. Just because your birds are inside doesn't mean that the disease is gone. With this kind of disease load in the environment and with the cooler temperatures, we are going to be running into some challenges as to how we're going to be able to manage this disease, because it likes the cold weather. So that means that if these birds are shedding virus in the environment, you might run through it with the ATV or your hip waders and still be able to bring it to the farm. Now, that being said, and this is just a bit of a pickup from last week, the Ontario government did announce a biosecurity program for the non-supply managed poultry industry. So there's $1.5 million that was announced last week. There is more details to come. As I mentioned last week, they're still working on the eligibility criteria and the applications. That should be hopefully available into the beginning of the new year. It's going to be a very tight timeline, but you can see this news release here. I guess, Ashley, I should get you to, actually, we'll post this. I'll post this in the chat so people can get access to it. And then if there's, and more details will be coming online at our Canadian Agricultural Partnership page. So right now, all that's listed is just this for now, but more details will come in the next few weeks. So stay tuned in the new year and keep those pages handy so you can see. With that, I will push it back to Ashley, and I'll stop sharing, and I'll put this link in the page or in the chat.
Thanks, Al. And we did actually post that on that biosecurity page. If you just scroll down below where Al was showing before. So
All right.
all we can do
I
is
see
stay
it.
tuned.
Biosecurity funding. There it is.
Yes. And the good news is, with as much as we're ending the webinar series, we're still going to have the high-path avian influenza small flock listserv going. So we've got, if you've signed up for that to get the email updates, then we're going to be pumping out any updates that are relevant. So that is something that I would highly recommend you do.
Excellent.
Thanks, Al. So now we're going to call upon Lucy to give us the news.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me tonight. Tonight, I'm going to present a few slides about the avian influenza in pigeons. The highly pathogenic avian influenza virus subtype H5N1 threatens animals' health across the world, and the susceptibility of pigeons to H5N1 and their role in avian influenza virus transmission to domestic birds and humans remains questionable if you search on the internet. I pulled some studies and some examples that will demonstrate the opposite. I have some avian influenza facts, and just keep in mind that all orders of the birds have been demonstrated to be susceptible to infection with the virus, but they display a spectrum of susceptibility as well as severity of symptoms accordingly with the respective order. As an example, chickens, turkeys, quail, and guinea fowl are highly susceptible to infection with severe morbidity, mortality, gross, and histological lesions, whereas ducks, gulls, starlings, and pigeons are considered least susceptible and display few or no clinical signs. Feral pigeons and doves naturally associate with the environments where food, water, and nesting sites are available, leading to close association with humans and poultry in cities and on farms. And also, pigeons and doves are under the spotlight for their potential role as breed species in the ecology of avian influenza with virus transmission between poultry and migratory waterfowl population and poultry sites during disease outbreak. Back in 2014, after the first H5N1 epidemic, it was a surge in studies followed the highly pathogenic avian influenza epidemic. And this review collated the data of avian influenza virus in pigeons and doves, both from a surveillance perspective, as well as the results of numerous clinical studies. There were about 32 results from 24 countries across 4 continents indicated the virus presence of 8.01% in pigeons and doves, but only 0.37% of total were associated with exposure to the same serotype as HPAI outbreak that happen in the poultry at the same time. There were some experimental studies, and among 22 infection studies with both highly pathogenic or low pathogenic viruses, and this started back in 1944, only 26 out of 715 mortalities were reported. Giving an example about between study number 1 and study number 2, in study number 1, they were inoculated with strains of low pathogenic avian influenza virus, about 82 pigeons, and the only mortalities, 3 out of 88 were recorded in the study, but these pigeons were immune suppressed, chemically induced. And all other pigeons experimentally infected with low pathogenic avian influenza strains remain clinically healthy. For the second study, they infected pigeons with highly pathogenic strain, which it is, one of them, it's H5N1. They were observing lesions were detected virus in many organs, including the liver, the pancreas, the trachea, the spleen, the thymus, the heart, the bursa, and intestines. Of course, there were variation in severity of infection and duration were observed depending on a strain and inoculum dose. The first time when it was noted a natural infection, H5N1 in domestic pigeons, it was in Egypt in 2014. And this is the first description and characterization of highly pathogenic avian influenza in naturally infected pigeons. The finding revealed that pigeons can indeed be susceptible to this virus and could be a source of infection to other birds and humans. The results reveal that this virus is continually evolving and changing its pathogenicity to be able to replicate and shed from infected pigeons, consequently increasing the risk of transmission to other avian species and humans. It was a flock of 50 pigeons, and then they exhibited greenish diarrhea and nervous manifestation and sudden deaths with a mortality rate up to 50% between 10 days. During necropsy, they found congestion of internal organs, especially with lungs and brain, and they were isolating the H5N1 from those affected pigeons. Now, this study evaluated the infectivity, pathogenicity, and transmission of H5N6, highly pathogenic avian influenza in mandarin ducks and domestic pigeons. And this was published in June 2021. And none of the birds showed clinical signs or mortality due to H5N6 infection, but there was a replication and transmission of the virus by direct and indirect contact between mandarin ducks. And also it was a replication and transmitted by direct contact between pigeons, but the viral shedding titer and duration were relatively lower and shorter. And also the virus was detected in internal organs of infected mandarin ducks and pigeons, indicating a systemic infection. And the results indicated that mandarin ducks and pigeons can be subclinically infected with this virus and transfer the virus to other birds. This spring in Ontario, I do have a copy of a results with one of the infected premises. They did a surveillance and they tested, they did some swabbing on the pigeons, and then one of them was positive. So they found the H5 in that pigeon. And that was in Ontario this spring. Now, in conclusion, in contrast to the clinical sporadic distribution, most studies found that neurological signs were very characteristic finding in pigeons infected with highly pathogenic viruses. And then this suggests that the nervous system in pigeons is frequently affected by this virus, even with asymptomatic infection. And even a pigeon may appear clinical healthy and it is not shedding the virus, but still has infected internal organs that predators and scavengers are at risk of infection. I have a classic example of that cat in Thailand that became infected and died of H5N1 after consuming a pigeon that was detected with positive H5N1. Results also support the theory that strain differences contribute to the severity of disease induced in pigeons. But also other source of avian influenza virus transmission is a mechanical route, such as fomites on pigeons' feet and feathers from contaminated environmental sources. And as everybody is telling you, and then including this webinar, that this virus is a pathogen that is notorious for evolving to adapt to new hosts and transmission mechanisms. And we have examples of the virus found in mammals, as Brian said, and an array of bird species, including raptors and scavengers. So it is everywhere, and then it's including in pigeons, unfortunately. That's all I have for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. I was just wondering, to what extent is there this kind of idea of formal research on various bird types, or is it kind of opportunistic? As something happens, we start testing?
It's the same as we've had the infected premise in Ontario. They tested as a surveillance because they saw the pigeons there, and it's like, okay, let's swap them too. But normally you don't, like it's as if they found a bird that is being like with clinical science, then they will be submitted to the laboratory. So
Okay.
yes.
Because I was just thinking, like, yeah, 1944, obviously, you know, World War II is happening. It's interesting that they took time out of their day to do this research, but not really something that you commonly hear about as
Because,
much.
yeah, it is that myth that pigeons are very resistant to this, but maybe it was related to low pathogenic avian influenza, not highly pathogenic avian influenza. This H5N1, it is very new to North American continent. And then that will pose threat to, I would say, all the birds, like regardless what type of species they are. So
yes, and now lots of mammals as well.
That's correct.
Thank you for pulling that all together. It's kind of, yeah, you probably had to do a bit of digging to get all that. So thank you.
It's sad, but sorry that I've had to deliver this, but like,
yeah,
what you're trying to find on the internet versus the publishing documents, they're completely different. So
yes, yeah. Okay, so we're going to move over to questions. So I'll just call our panelists to come back on screen. And I do see we have a question about egg shortages. So in the UK, there's some news being reported that there's going to be egg rations happening. Is there any sense that this will be happening in Canada? Are we able to comment on that?
I can take a crack at that one. Actually, let me plug in again. The challenge with the UK is that they've got a lot of production that's outside. And with the UK, those outside birds, of course, are at risk. And with that risk came to the high infection rate that the UK has. So UK has actually ordered every bird inside. So egg shortages are going to take are going to be a challenge in the UK. They may be a challenge in the US because of some of the big integrators, like Iowa lost 1 million birds a couple of weeks ago on one complex. The egg prices in the US have come up because of supply management and the way our system is in Canada. We haven't really seen that increase. Yes, eggs have gone up, but that was something that was happening before even influenza came in. So at this point, we have been really lucky with that, and I don't think we've actually had many egg farms that were impacted. And with supply management, we actually supply our domestic production of eggs, so we aren't really importing a lot of eggs from the US. So anyways, at this point, your egg supply is still safe.
It's good to know. Thank you, Al. So if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat. Got a quiet group tonight. Tori, when you were talking, I was just curious about, so CFIA is obviously federal, so we work nationally. Like, is there special groups that work in each province, or are you sharing among the provinces? How does that response work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do have, like, each province will have their own like emergency response team set up. So in Ontario, we have a big group, a big incident command structure. So we have like our command groups. There's two guys that are a command group for Ontario. Then we have our operational groups, and we have our planning group and our logistics and finance group. So it kind of just like, think of it like a family tree kind of thing. So you'd have your chiefs of each one, and then you'd have individual people under each chief that would work together to try and accomplish whatever needs to happen operationally or would plan in the planning space or finance space. So that happens in each and every province. Right now, we are sending people from Ontario out west just because of the vast need of people out there. So we are sharing resources, sharing people, whatever kind of needs to happen. But yeah, ideally, you would work kind of within your own province and help out within your own province. But it's not an ideal world right now. So we are kind of just sharing us around as much as we can.
Yeah. That's great. That's a good behind the scenes view. It's kind of similar to the hospital system where it's like, there's only so many people doing this job right now. And so we want to make sure we take care of those people and are using them and not overusing them. Okay, we've got a question about migratory geese coming through. Is there anything around swans dying off or any other sorts of die-offs that we're seeing?
So swan specifically, we have seen a handful of cases of swans, both trumpeter and mute swans that have died as a result of avian influenza. Not a lot. I want to say I've only had maybe 2 to 4 cases since H5N1 has come onto the landscape. Other species dying off, the big ones are still Canada geese is the major one, and then a lot of our scavengers. So the bald eagles and turkey vultures, especially in the spring. We were seeing quite a number of them dying off.
Do you think that's based on general population? Like there's just that many more Canada geese, or is it behavior or susceptibility?
Yeah, so it probably is a combination of all of those. And the other thing with Canada geese is where they're found. They're often in parks, so people are going to see them more commonly than some of the other bird species. So I think that's part of it as well. Not only is it a large population out there, but they're also interacting in areas where people are going to be seeing them, exhibiting neurological signs, and contact the appropriate authorities when they see them. And then there probably is some susceptibility differences between these species. And I know Chris and his group are going to be working on doing antibody testing on some of these species just to determine are Canada geese getting over infection, and if so, what percentage are recovering from infection. But that work is going to be ongoing for the next little while, I know. So hopefully we'll have better answers come the spring, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Brian, would you say that this is more of this is a duck disease that happens to be jumping into other species? So when it jumps into some of our larger waterfowl, or especially the scavengers, that's when we see some of these problems, because we're not really seeing lots of mallards dying.
Yeah, and part of that is with like the mallards and some of those other duck species. Those are typically the species that we think of as being the carriers for avian influenza. So it's likely a lot of those birds, the mallards and some of the other dabbling ducks, are much more resistant to severe disease with this. And when it's jumping into some of these other birds like the geese and the swans, they just happen to be a little bit more susceptible to the virus itself.
So unfortunately, we can't put a commingling order against the wild birds, because that's where we get that disease transmission.
Okay. So we're just a question about the animal protection group PAWS, and I don't remember what that acronym stands for, but do they come onto the sites during small flock investigations, I guess I'll say? Or is there a relationship there with PAWS and any active sites happening?
So PAWS stands for the Provincial Animal Welfare Service, right? So they're part of the Solicitor General. They're a group that deal with animal welfare and egregious acts, similar to what OSPC used to do years ago. So, you know, if there is challenges on a site because of animal welfare, then PAWS would become involved. But generally they're not on our IPs. I don't know if Tori wants to comment on it, but like there's really not much reason for PAWS to be on site unless there's an egregious animal welfare concern.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. Unless there was a need for them to be on the site, then we would collaborate with them as well. But if there's no need for them to be on the site, they won't be there.
Does anyone know much about raccoon behavior? Are they starting to hibernate? Someone noted that there was one on the deck and it wasn't really moving along as the dog was barking on it, and they had seen another one recently on the side of the road just kind of hanging out, presumably in the middle of the day, but I'm not too sure.
Yeah, so raccoons can be infected with a number of different viruses. So we talk on these webinars about highly pathogenic avian influenza and how it can affect raccoons. But much more commonly in raccoons, canine distemper virus would be a major one. And we can never rule out rabies virus as well. So depending on where you are, it could be one of those other viruses that is causing this disease in this raccoon. Especially in urban centers. So in larger city centers, canine distemper virus tends to run rampant through the raccoon population, and they can exhibit many different behavioral changes. So seizures, so actual neurological disease, but then just abnormal behavior like is described in this question, just not responding to stimuli that it normally would, seeming out of it, sometimes approaching people or having increased aggression. So I usually recommend if people notice a raccoon that is acting abnormal and they're concerned, then to contact the appropriate municipality or humane society, whoever deals with wildlife control in your city, and contacting them and letting them know about it, because they may come out, capture that raccoon. If it seems like a disease that they could be rehabilitated for, they may send it to a rehabilitation center, or they may end up euthanizing the raccoon and then having it tested for rabies virus just to confirm that that is not what is the concern with that raccoon.
Why is rabies one of those diseases that seems highly tracked and reported on in Canada?
Mainly because of its potential to jump into people. So when you compare it to, say, canine distemper virus, which is much more common than rabies, canine distemper virus has never been shown to jump into people and cause disease in people, whereas rabies virus is a very serious disease and basically has a 100% mortality rate when you are infected with it. So it comes back to public health, and it is going to be tracked much more closely. And that's also why the Ministry of Natural Resources has put a lot of money into eradicating certain strains of rabies from the province. There are multiple strains that are here in Ontario, and the ones that we talk about most commonly with our raccoons and others are the raccoon rabies strain. So that's why if you ever hear about the MNRF putting out alerts about they're going to be putting oral baits in an area, or showing you pictures of oral baits and just telling you to leave them alone when they're out there, those are to basically help vaccinate raccoons and help decrease the amount of rabies that's circulating in those populations.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, and I guess that's why the push at the vet hospital just to say get your yearly rabies updates on your dogs, particularly because they're out and about.
Yes, and especially with domestic dogs and cats, I believe it is the law that you have to have your animal vaccinate for rabies virus.
Right. Yeah, I got the what for last time I took my cats in, because there was also the human component, because she said, if your cat bites me and I don't know its vaccine status, I have to go through a protocol that I'm not very happy about. So I got guilted into doing it, and now I feel better having done it. So.
And of course, the bats in the house that
Yes.
he can
Yes,
rabies.
I did have a bat in the house. So.
Yes, and the bat rabies is the one that unfortunately we will have forever probably in the province, just because there's no easy way to vaccinate bats, whereas we can give the oral vaccine to raccoons and other species.
Right. Thanks for that flashback, Lucy, on the old bat in the house. So there was a question about wild birds recovering from HPAI. Do we have any idea how long the birds stay infectious or are capable of shedding virus? Any info on that?
Lucy, I don't know if you have any info on that. That's not something that I've really read into.
I should probably give you a couple of examples of like how virus survives in the environment, and so we'll have a better information. It's not about how much virus or the virus is being excreted by that bird that is sick, where after she recovered, it's mostly the virus can be on the surface of, like on the feathers, it can be on her paws, it can be on organic matter, it can be in the water, and then when they did the testing back in 2014, this virus travels between 70 to 100 meters, but over 1,000 meters, if it travels by air, is not effective. On the flies, on the surface of the flies and in the guts, it stays about 96 hours. So they can be effective as well. It survives very well in the water, and in Canada is considered a very very ideal environment for conservation conditions for the virus. It's because at 4 degrees it will resist about 200 to 300 days. So to answer the question, I don't have a specific answer for if the birds survive, how much is going to excrete, and then when and how long. But if it survives over 100 days on the feathers, I will consider that bird being effective, even though she's not excreting the virus to her feces or respiratory. So
Right.
I had a conversation with Chris Sharp about this too, and we just don't know too, because it's a novel virus to North America. He's posed the question of, well, can waterfowl get it and then get it again next year, or like how long will this virus be circulating? How long will it be infectious? And one thing I forgot to mention is that, and I'm doing this at the producer update tomorrow, if you're handling poultry, get your flu shot, right? Like that's been something that's been pushed by the Ministry of Health for years. Anyone who deals with swine and poultry is really recommended to get the flu shot every fall, because viruses like to mutate, and this virus is no exception. So I think, Lucy, there's already been some mutational drift with the North American strain. Have we seen that with that?
yes, so we do have the Eurasian one, but to give an example, what's happening right now in British Columbia, they have 4 variants already, like North American variants, 4 of them. So it mutates very easy. So yeah.
And as Chris had mentioned, one of the things that we've never seen before with highly pathogenic avian influenza of this strain is that it would kill wild birds. Like, Brian's never been this busy. I don't think they even let you out of the house anymore, Brian.
Yeah.
In the lab.
I get to come home to do talks like this.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you
We
for that.
appreciate you.
But yeah, as Al said, I mean, we've never seen an avian influenza virus do this to wild birds. So this is very different from anything we've ever seen before.
All right. I'm not seeing any other questions. It's 7:15. I guess we can call it a night. So thank you very much to all of our speakers for preparing some really interesting things to think about and consider. Check out the PIC website for any of the resources. Definitely put that mental health thing first and foremost when we're going through our days here. And we'll see you next week for our final session.